Thanks for listening to the Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast. We hope that you find the conversations to be helpful and enlightening as you get to hear from those involved in the Evangelical Friends movement. Be sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss when a new episode comes out. Now, enjoy the episode.
Well, let us get going. I know that let me kind of just say welcome to the next episode of Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast. And I'm here, Austin, and Jacob is with us. But he's not going to come on like quite right now.
I'll be on very soon.
Okay. And for our guest today, we have Grant Banham, and I'm excited. This is kind of outside of our norm. But we were talking about so this also going to tie into what he said earlier about his setup and D&D and all that stuff. I've noticed, I'm just going to kind of give a little like preface. In the last I don't know, 5 years, I have seen D&D in the Christian community kind of explode. And I have seen lots of people who I would just not expect play D&D do, from men, women, pastors, and it's kind of not talked about, and in kind of a weird, it's like this subculture thing that's happening. But I think there's like a really big conversation to go on to have here, and especially as we think about different ways we can, like where are the ways that the kingdom can come into this. And I was specifically reminded of an article in Christianity Today that was like several years ago, kind of talking about this very topic of like, where does D&D land in Christianity and the church. And anyway, I know that when me and Grant were talking, I was like, oh, I'd love to have you on the podcast. Like, what do you want to talk about? And he was like, I want to talk about D&D. And I was like, wow. I was like, and at first I was like, I don't know how we're going to quite do that. But I do think that it is a topic that I think is interesting, and it's going to be a little bit different. And I'm excited to have our guest on for today. So Grant, why don't you introduce yourself, and then also maybe explain to the audience who may not be familiar what D&D is. And
Sure.
Yeah.
So my name is Grant Banham. I am part of the Northwest Yearly Meeting. I attend and do a lot of work at City's Edge. I preach there and run events and all sorts of fun stuff, work with kids. I also am the program director for Camp Tilikum out there, one of the yearly meeting affiliated Christian camps. I've been doing that for a few years, and I'm also the chair of the Youth and Young Adult Board in yearly meeting as well. So I have a lot of different roles that I fulfill across the board. But my life is very, very tied into Quaker and Christian networks at this point, which is a little new for me because I don't know, like I always just was a little outside of the Quaker church for quite a while, and a lot of my friendships and fellowship was sort of on kind of rim of that, and so I wasn't deeply tied into the whole community as much. But
I find that really surprising, actually.
Yeah,
knowing who your parents are.
It's interesting. Yeah, we were, I would say, up until I was probably about 19 or 20, I was pretty outside of the whole spectrum there. But,
really?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to try to not drift off, but I really want to as an interviewer, I smell blood.
We can
Also,
talk
I just
about
wanted
that
to-
some other time, but
I wanted to get in a little joke when you say you have a lot of roles. I would say, are they critical roles?
Oh,
crazy relevant. Yeah, so I can give a little bit of a rundown of what D&D is. So again, just for clarification though, we're not just talking about Dungeons and Dragons specifically. We're talking about tabletop RPGs, which
Okay,
is
yeah.
a very wide spectrum of games and genres at this point that is blown up drastically.
That I think that is a good clarification.
Yeah. And so it's like we'll probably at least I'll use the term D&D a lot. I will mean more than just Dungeons and Dragons. I will be meaning tabletop RPGs as a whole. But so I think one of the best ways I can describe it is there's a dude who was an old school RPG designer whose name was literally John Wick, that explained tabletop games as like a game of chess, but it's like each piece has a name and personal motivations. And if, like them acting on those motivations is kind of what an RPG is. So it's you have roles and pieces that all serve distinct purposes and all follow within particular guidelines, but across the board it's about drafting a story and giving motivations to these characters and these pieces and playing it within these roles. And so D&D is basically storytelling but in a very board game like setting. And so what you do is you usually have a character sheet that you're playing as. You roll dice to determine outcomes for actions that you take. And you're just playing through a full story. You're playing through a series of events, or a campaign as it's usually called, that weaves in narratives about these characters and events, and it can take place in fantasy settings, science fiction settings, modern settings, whatever it might be. But that's a little bit of what D&D and tabletop games are.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. I mean, so I just full disclosure, have played D&D and some of these sorts of like genre kinds of games. But I don't play them anymore, not because I have any like qualms about them. I just don't. But it was something that I kind of did when I was younger. So I have a kind of general assumption. But yeah, like just for some clarifying though, for people who don't know these terms, RPG means a role-playing game. So essentially you have like a character or a role, and it's a game. So, so you find yourself in there. But so what do you think the draw is for these sorts of games? Because I have seen like this market. I don't, and this is anecdotally. I don't know if there's like stats behind this. I couldn't look that up, but it seems like D&D like games or just board games in general are kind of having a moment in a way that they didn't like 10 years ago.
Absolutely. So
Can you speak a little closer to your mic? You're kind of quiet.
Yeah, I'll move it in a little bit more. So I think that D&D and tabletop games really had their initial heyday in the 1980s. Like from, we'll say, like 1970s is when Dungeons and Dragons was first introduced, and the idea of tabletop games, it really hit its stride in the 1980s with nerd culture at the time. And so that's just kind of to preface it all a little bit. And of course, there was a lot of Christian reaction towards it at the time, especially tied into the Satanic Panic and that.
We'll get into that later.
We can get into that. Yeah, talk about that in a little bit. What really made the resurgence happen recently was the coolness of nerddom again, that came back, especially in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that gave rise to the validity of D&D as like a fun way to play board games and tabletop stuff, as there was a little bit of a resurgence there. But I think two of the biggest contributors were actually both Stranger Things and Critical Role. Those are the two that I look at, and I think most people would say it was around 2016, 2017 that as Critical Role, which is the largest Dungeons and Dragons podcast, YouTube series. It's now an Amazon animated series. There's all that. That was climbing up. It was being streamed weekly, and people were just going into it because they loved the characters, they loved the conversations. That was just huge popularity. And then, of course, Stranger Things, which is about the kids that start off playing D&D, and then it becomes relevant to their own stories. And I think that those two were really, really big contributors to the popularity of it. And so it was in that phase of time that, like, nerd culture was way more acceptable. It was showing up in larger media formats, that it just started blowing up because of that, because of those factors. Yeah, and I think just as time went on, it maintained its relevancy because of the stories that people were then able to craft together. It was a more interactive format of playing games. It was more of a community development thing with the addition of technology and stuff, and things like Zoom and Discord, that you can have games online with your friends. It gives a reason to be able to connect with each other. And so during the pandemic, that was a really great opportunity for people to bond. Like, there were just a lot of factors that built up to the success that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, and like I think it's crazy to me because I remember when I was a kid, like playing D&D was not cool. Like to say that you played was like a death sentence. It was just like you'd be relegated to irrelevance forever. And it was kind of seen as like lame and overly nerdy. And it had a lot of negative associations, like from, like both from like the Christian culture, like as you said, with about like the whole like satanic panic stuff. But then also on the other side, you had it like it was just like, if you play D&D, you're a dweeb who's gonna like live in your mom's basement forever and not have a job, right? And it's striking to me how like there was a full-on Hollywood movie with like an A-list actor, and then like I was like, what is this? And then like I was listening to another podcast, and it was like a fitness podcast. Okay, these are kind of like um not the typical who you'd think is like playing D&D, and they like had a full on conversation about it, and I was like really surprised. I was like, this there is something happening. There is something really appealing, and I do think that you bring up the whole community aspect about it, right? And the interactive piece, because I do think that that's something like, how many of us in the last 10 years have like lost sense of a community, and where you have like rhythms of regularly checking in with people, and these things are like intense. They're not just like, these games are pretty interactive, and you have to be pretty, you can't like half do them, right? It takes a commitment, and I think that there's like something really interesting there, that I wonder if this pull of like trying to find an activity, trying to bond, and I think this is especially true with guys, though I would love to know who plays D&D or these tabletop games, because I would assume that it would skew more male than female. That's my sense, but I definitely think that there is a solid female contingent. I'm not denying that. It's just,
I don't know. I think it's, in all of my experiences, it's been very, very balanced.
okay.
Most of the games that I've played have been pretty much equal parts guys and girls.
Interesting.
That I don't know. I look at a lot of D&D games at this point, and it's like they've almost, for young adults and people in their like 20s and 30s, it's sort of fulfilled almost the role of small groups at this point.
I can totally see that.
Kind of in place of other areas to build up community. It's something that you can do instead of game nights or other ways to connect, where now you can just bond participating in another style of like play and community. But in these instances, you can actually play as different characters and enjoy being a part of the same story and have your little side conversations as well that may or may not tie into it, but that there's an ebb and flow to the communication style that D&D has
Mhm.
that I think is a really unique way for people to connect.
I also think those kind of interesting is that it's one of those sorts of activities that it's cooperative. Like, right, there's like a lot of games where it's like, say that you're doing like a pickup basketball game, for example.
Yeah.
There's a competition there, but like one team wins, one team loses, right? Where like that's not quite the same element.
Yeah.
1 second.
I'm just kind of curious. So I am not a D&D person. I've never played any type of tabletop RPG, D&D or not. Kind of like Austin said, I have no moral issue with it. That is not the reason. I just never got into it. I did not grow up in a household that
Interesting.
did it. I did not grow up with friends that did it. Literally just never have been presented with the opportunity. But so from my very outsider understanding of it, you mentioned that there's the aspect of community, which I'm not doubting for sure, but I'm curious, like you say, like more than game nights or something. So I will go over to friends' house to play board games and whatever. But my understanding of D&D is like you may be meeting for weeks, months on the same story. So like I can't just come crash your D&D hangout tonight, right? Like I'd be entering in the middle of a story. I don't have a character. So on that aspect, it to me it does seem a little exclusionary. Is that true? Like if I have a game night tonight, I can invite anybody and whoever shows up, we can play Ticket to Ride. But I can't
Yes.
just come to your D&D thing tonight. Like I'm not going to have a place to fit into the story.
Yeah. And I think that's why it fills in the realm of small groups a little bit more, is ones that are generally kind of exclusionary. And I think that there's always been a place for like doing both board game nights and D&D nights. Like that just seems to be pretty intuitive most of the time. But
Mm-hmm.
uh D&D, you can have these longer drawn out campaigns. There are also people that do drop in, drop out games as well. So you have ones where you can have your regular group of players and then some other people that can join in as a character for a couple sessions, get acquainted with it. I've been a part of a few of those games over time, so it depends on the intensity of the story. It can be exclusionary depending on how serious of a game it is, but there are
Mm-hmm.
other times where you can just say it's like, hey, we're running a D&D game night tonight. Why don't you come on over and join? And that kind of thing is actually a pretty common way to run games.
Okay. Yeah, I knew some
Or
people who did it, and they were talking once about like, I want to bring so and so, but my group's gonna have to like meet tonight and vote on if we can let them come in. I was like, whoa, that sounds pretty serious.
yeah. So I was introduced to D&D. I liked it before it was cool. I'm one of those people, I can say that. But not terribly long before it was cool. So I started playing around 2013, so it was like 2 or 3 years before the shows and series and
Before
the
Stranger Things
really
made it
big
popular.
popularity started coming up. Um, but the reason that I got into it is because I had like a lot of my youth leaders were in a game and I was really excited. I was like, "Oh, I want to hang out with these guys some more. These people are like all my mentors and leaders." And they just kind of took me aside and they're like, "You can join if you want to." And so I joined like right in the middle of one of their campaigns that they were doing.
Mm.
And I was like 17 at the time and I was just super excited. I was like, "Oh, I can hop into this. I don't even really know what it is. I just want to be around these people." And there was no concern about it either because like I had no idea about any of the stipulations of what D&D might entail and like is it a demonic game or anything like that. But the the group that I was playing with just immediately set all of those fears to rest for basically everyone in our church, going like, "Oh, it's these people playing this game. that very likely means it's a very safe and okay game to play. There were no worries about the influences that it would have, or if I would uh, start sacrificing goats on our church's front doorstep. um, and so I had that connection point where I started bonding more with the youth leaders that were in our church and some of the other people there, because they were starting up this new game. And I think what was the most valuable to me was I was equal with them in that instance. That usually in other circumstances, it's like, yeah, if they're running this game or this activity, I'm still a kid and they're my leaders. But when we joined this game together, when we all played it together, it was a level playing field all of a sudden, that the characters that we were playing all had the same level of input, had the same ability to shape the story, had the same uh, relationship dynamics. And it gave me a place to kind of build more confidence as a person, because I had a lot of that fear to do it in other areas of real life. But in the game, I was able to be someone who had that confident and sometimes brash attitude that I wish I had a little bit more of in real life. But since I was around trusted people, I could display that and feel safe. And so that was just huge when I was around, between the ages of like 17 and 18, when I was building up the kind of person I wanted to be. I started developing a sense of security in the personalities that I could have, because I had a place to start doing it without fear of rejection or failure. Like, it just made a huge, huge difference in my personality and the structuring of the kind of guy that I really wanted to be.
Yeah, I think that that's really powerful in the sense of like you had this thing, right? This activity that you could do where it addressed like all these different aspects of, community, right? That like all of us, we like, I remember being in a youth group and just like wanting to spend time with my youth leaders and having their input and developing those relationships. But the kind of the truth is, it's like it's hard to find that naturally.
Yeah.
Like it's not like something you're just going to be like, oh, I'm just going to like sit down and just like spill my guts to you. That feels awkward. Not like all the time, right? Like there's those times where you want to like share something really deep, but like having some sort of activity to facilitate that sort of like that relationship, I think is really key. And then the other thing too is it's regular, right? It's not like so you had that like that connection, and I also think it's that, I mean, and that you're at the age also where it's like you're transitioning into being an adult, so where your youth leaders are becoming more like peers, and kind of making that transition. It is kind of interesting how in the church we often think in like hierarchies and stuff, and I think that that's good to a point, but it is also neat to hear how being able to like be on the same, level, how that like impacted you in a positive way.
Yeah, and that was just a way for me to break that mold and break that sense of discomfort. And I know it wasn't just me either, that there were some other guys in our church around my age that joined the game as well later on. And they were even more timid at the start than I was. And you could see the way that it changed their sense of confidence over the course of a few months, because they had this greater sense of self-assurance with how they talk to others, less fear about how they're being perceived, just because of the way that they were able to act in the game gave them some sense of relaxation and going, oh, I can speak up in a group. I can talk even to strangers. I can approach people in conversation that I never thought I could before. That it was almost a form for, I know a couple of them in particular, to approach evangelism in a whole new light. Because they're like, wow, if I can do this in this very small, intimate, and comfortable setting, what's the real fear of doing it to other people outside of it? Because they now have that confidence to be able to do it in that group, then they can do it elsewhere. It's just literally building up a voice.
Yeah, that's like really interesting. Just the idea of how these sorts of games can really build up social skills and confidence in social skills, because that is something that like people just are lacking. I recently just went to a well, and this is all because of technology. So like I recently went to this seminar about social media and teenagers, and one of the things that they talked about is it leads to like the overuse of social media is leading to decreases in social skills. And that people are becoming less and less attuned to things like, you know, body language and reading cues, and not only that, but even just having the confidence to be in social situations. That there's a very high, a newly high bar for like social anxiety that people are having.
Yeah.
And it is interesting how this is like if you think about it in a Christian context, that like it can help build those social skills that have been kind of eroded in like this like backdoor sort of a way, which then has like as a discipleship tool, like leads to being able to have like more conversations with people who are different than you, right? Because I think that that's like any Christian who cares about evangelism, you're going to be put in such it's inherently social, right? So you have to have some social skills, and like
It's really good at training that too, because you're just sitting like usually across from a table from someone else. You can see the way that they react to the way that you engage. You can become more comfortable with your own mannerisms. I think there's even something to be said about when you're playing a character, you choose the mannerisms that you want to express. And when you begin to choose those particular mannerisms, you have an idea of how other people will then respond to those mannerisms, and you really get a good sense of personal interaction and dialogue with other people just based off of that experience that you do on a routine level. Like, it is legitimately social practice.
Without having to go to a therapist.
Not that that's bad.
Not that that's bad.
Not that that's bad. I would not suggest just playing D&D games instead of going to therapy.
No, but like I do think that there is this, it's just opportunities to practice those skills, right?
Yes,
and like
absolutely.
Like even if you're like I'm not trying to like, I think we could have a whole second like podcast around therapy and mental health and stuff and have lots of really great conversations. What I'm trying to say is you still need to practice those skills, and if you like anything, if you don't practice a skill, it atrophies, and and you, especially if you're like not like, you know, if you've graduated from school and you are just kind of on your own, like how are you going to make these connections? How are you supposed to do these things? Especially if you're like working from home and you don't ever like see people, which is becoming more and more common.
Very true.
But I never thought about the communication skill base that you are training.
Yeah.
And how that can like lead to other sorts of positive developments in a Christian life.
And that was definitely one of the most impactful realms for me, is it built up that confidence. I think, of course, there's a lot of other realms that like D&D and tabletop games can influence and help you in different realms of your life. I know, for instance, a couple of the games that have been going on for the past few years, one of the ones that I've been running and then one of the ones that I'm a part of, some of the subjects that we've been broaching have been intentionally relevant to what some of our players have been going through in their lives recently. And implementing that can be really tricky, but if it's in the right context and with the right people, you can really go through some pretty heavy topics if you're with a group that you trust. And so, like, one of the ones right now in the game that I am a player in is we're going over the subject of like grief and loss and what that looks like. And several of our party members in the game have recently lost people close to them. And some of the ways that we've been broaching that subject with their characters and with just aspects of the story is a really beautiful way to kind of come together and share our insights, but do it outside of like the direct subject, but still process some of those feelings of it and be able to verbalize the emotion without fear of ridicule or anything like that. Like, it's a really patient and careful way to handle it, as long as you aren't going in and saying, all right, our D&D game today, we're going to be talking about the death of mothers.
Because 3 of you have lost your mothers
Because
recently.
3 of you have lost your mothers recently. Exactly. And so it's just like a really great instance to help people process through these things in safe areas. And also, there's the terminology table talk, which is conversation outside of the game. Usually like kind of meta conversations that may be about the game or just about other things in real life. Like, hey, how was your week? Or what have you done for work recently? I think some of the best conversations I've had in recent years have been conversations that have taken place before, after, and even sometimes during a D&D game. It's because we're already in kind of a intimate and secure setting, and so we're very willing to discuss heavier or hard subjects because we feel confident with the people that we're in and we're around. And so it may be related or unrelated to the game, but people are sometimes just very willing to have like frank conversations about serious topics in their lives because they're already in that relaxed, vulnerable stage that I think makes a huge difference in the way that we can broach subjects.
I have, well, one question before I guess we start to go down the satanic panic side
I'm
of
so
the
ready for
conversation.
this.
But
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, you can just speak for yourself because I'm sure it's different for everybody, but I'm just curious, like, how regularly are you meeting? You said you're going to do one here in just a second, so I'm assuming you have a standing Thursday game, whether that's weekly or bi-weekly or whatever. How often do you do it? And like, what happens if you can't come tonight? Like, I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I am a part of 3 games right now. I am running one that takes place every other week, and then I'm part of another game that takes place on those off weeks. Those ones happen at our church after the service, just like an hour or so after the service. And it's just as a way for some of us that are just part of the church service to get together afterwards and hang out. And sometimes it's pretty lighthearted, but for the most part, it's just games for us to kind of be on the same page and just have that little extra time of community together because most of us are conglomerated there already. And then the other game that I have is every week, and it's here, but it kind of is only seasonal-ish. That's not really the right word for it. It takes place about it's about a 7-month long game that goes on each year. So it's going to be going from around now to like March, I would say. But
Okay.
that is every week. It's a really fun game to be a part of because my best friend runs it. But
Yeah. And so what happens if you next week you're sick or next week
yeah,
you have to schedule a doctor's appointment and that's the only time you can do it.
Sometimes there's really easy outs for characters. Like you can just say, oh, my person is not around for this session, just depending on the way that it is. Other times, like if you're all like in one area that every character has to be a part of it, the person who runs the game, the DM or GM, will run my character and let me know of any major decisions that they make. Generally, they try to avoid doing major decisions, but it's kind of just a non-player character at that point.
Okay.
But then sometimes we just don't do the game, and that's fine if enough people call out, or there's particular instances where we'll do what's called like a one-shot, which is just a game that may take place in the same universe or a different universe or even just a different game altogether. That's just a one night, like we're getting together, hanging out, playing this game, which tends to be a really, really great opportunity for people that aren't super familiar with D&D or people that just want to be able to drop in to a game. It's like a really great chance for them to just hop in, be a part of a story that goes on for just a couple hours, play a character, roll some dice, and hang out with friends. And so those are all sort of different ways that those games will occur or not occur if some players are absent.
Now, what happens if you die in the game?
You die in real life. No. What happens in the game is some games there's ways that you can bring characters back, and it can all be a little bit cheesy, like, oh, you have a twin brother or a clone if you want to start playing the same character. Sometimes usually you just bring in a new character because you want to still be with that group.
Yeah.
You just have to do a reintroduction. But for the most part, it's pretty relaxed. I had just in the game that I've been playing recently, the character that I was playing died, and we just found a way for him to just come back a little while later. And
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I mean, you could just, resurrections happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you can just play around with it. There's ways in the story to make it happen. That's what happened with my character. My character's kind of like a superhero Groot type character that is partially like a tree, and so I was able to just sort of come back due to tree magic. But there's always these fun ins and outs that you can do to make it happen in the story. Some games that I've been a part of before, like if characters die, that's just you kind of wrap up the game where it seems very natural, and then you can pick up another game later on.
Yeah.
Sometimes players find like reasons like, yeah, I played D&D for a while, I'm gonna hop out and then let me know when you're doing the next campaign. But it's all very fluid and it's handled differently almost every time.
Now let's get to probably the question that's burning in the back of a lot of our listeners' minds.
I just want to say, I wish we should have thought about this. We should have had someone on here who is against D&D, like who could have come on in a non-combative way and, had their point. But yeah, obviously none of us have any issue with it. So I personally, I'll just say I struggle to get into the mindset of someone who really would be upset by that. I just genuinely don't even know.
Maybe I can, be that character.
Sure.
I'll play that role. But like, okay, so for those who might be like, what's the problem? What's the big deal? Like during the 80s, there was and I think even up until like the early 2000s, there were a lot of Christian groups who were concerned about a lot of just fantasy related things, but specifically with D&D, there was the accusation that it encouraged sorcery and the veneration of demons, according to a Wikipedia article that I read. I think that this idea kind of surrounds a lot of the fantasy games, fantasy books, right? Like I remember, friends not being able to read Harry Potter, for example. But and so I think there's a lot of skepticism people have around these sorts of things, around the fantasy genre. And to be fair, and this is where I'm going to be like, maybe like put on the like the role here. Something that I have noticed, and this could be a whole other podcast, is the rise of witchcraft and paganism. So
yeah.
like it's real. Like
Yeah.
witchcraft and paganism is also having a moment, and like so much to the point where like I went to a Barnes and Noble, and the magic sorcery section where they're like selling like tarot cards and other sort of magic paraphernalia in books was bigger than the Bible section. And
Yep.
like I remember when I first became a Christian and I went to the Barnes and Noble, the Christian section was pretty big, and there was like rows of Bibles that you could purchase. And it was just like this like one little tiny area. And then I was like, what? Or it's like I go into, like right downtown Salem, there is like a straight up like magic store. Like not like
Yeah.
like magic like illusions, like magic as in like crystals and candles and smudges and all sorts of things that you'd want to like that you need to practice witchcraft. So
Yeah.
there's like, and there is a part of me that wonders, have we made like things like witchcraft and sorcery cool? And so now it has like validated this in real life, like right in the fake world, it's kind of fun, and now in like real life, it's like cool again. And especially with the decrease in trust in religious institutions, but that impulse of like that spiritual impulse and that even that like supernatural impulse is still like alive and well for a lot of people. So like, can you speak to some of the like cagey skepticism that, like if I was going to be this person who's just like, I think that this is actually a doorway to witchcraft, like just in straight up paganism, and Christians should not do it, especially since the Bible is like pretty clear that, sorcery and witchcraft is really bad.
Yeah. So I think where I'd probably want to start is a lot of that initial satanic panic was deeply tied into the fear of just the fear of the occult and fear of like what is witchcraft and wizardry. The Bible clearly speaks against it, and that it has some real sway or power over people. And that in Christian realms in particular, that because of that reality, and that there are people that believed in that, or in scripture, you see some of the genuine like sorcery that was
Yeah.
done in
King
various
Saul.
instances. Exactly.
And the medium, and it's one of the
Yep.
reasons why God like allows him and his family to be destroyed.
Yeah. That kind of stuff, whenever mentioned, it's terrifying, because it's clearly something that God does not respond well to. That it is something that we are not supposed to partake in, but there's still a reality of it. And that in D&D, there was a mixture of what the fantasy and reality was.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think this is where I my opinion is a little aggressive, but I think there's actually a good portion of modern occult and witchcraft that is done that is reactionary, based on Christians' fear of those things. That because of the satanic panic of the like 80s and 90s, that there were other people that may have been disillusioned by Christian faith or just didn't really believe in it, that were like, well, maybe there's something to this other that they seem to be afraid of. That if they're thinking
Yeah.
that there is really a negative reciprocation to this, if there's something genuinely evil about it or some power to it, and we're all beings that seek to fill a void in our hearts that can only be supplemented by Jesus Christ, that we're going to fill that void with other things, that there is that pursuit of the otherworldly or the witchcraft that might be out there, or the occult that could answer or fill that void of spiritual that we don't know how to fill otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's such a reactionary response that kind of bolstered that. Is it was not necessarily because of D&D directly, like, oh, I'm playing as a wizard, now I believe that this is real. That I think that it was because almost of how Christians had this fear in response to it, and it began to give it more power and resonance than it would have had otherwise, because there was this transition where we didn't really understand that it's fantasy, it's fictional, and we weren't able to separate that sense of fictionality with the reality of it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's just both how Christians and non-Christians responded to the media.
So your argument is like it's kind of the metaphor of like, you have, a teenager and their mom like freaks out about something, then like the teenager in like their rebellious spirit's gonna just be like, well, I'm just gonna double down on that. And you're like
I definitely think,
sort of like
there's a
you're
level of
freaking out, so
influence
now I'm
there.
gonna just
I think that that's definitely a part of it. I do not think that's all of it, because I do see that there's a huge rise. And I think that that's more just tied into people seeking spiritual value in other areas besides a god, in areas and realms that they have more control over. That kind of led to the rise of popularity of it. I think that if you're looking at games like D&D and stuff, or most tabletop games, like witchcraft and wizardry doesn't really overlap very well. Because you're not, and I don't know, this may be my own biased standpoint, but it's really easy to tell the fictionality of that. And there's nothing that you do in the game that makes you go, oh, this is obviously how it correlates to real life. We can do these same spells.
no, and
like,
and I don't know if most Christians would believe that. I think that that'd be a really like,
Well,
I
that's
think
where
people
my struggle is, because it's like, and this is maybe just a really easy example, but it's like Christians love Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of the Narnia, which are fantasy and involve witches and sorcerers and magic. But
and I think that
because they have a
also,
Christian allegory, it's like, woohoo, we love it. But
and
suddenly D&D
I
is
can
bad.
definitely see that as part of the resurgence, and how we're also getting back to the realm of Christians playing D&D is, like, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both were sort of pioneers in making those realms a little bit more acceptable to Christian audiences.
Yeah.
Because it has those impacts and influences of like spiritual and witches and wizards and all that stuff, and kind of made it a little bit more approachable than it was otherwise. But realistically, I think there probably were just some horror stories or like off instances back in the 1980s that maybe some news outlets and sensationalists got a hold of and latched on to these, I don't know, situations that might have gotten out of hand. Because D&D was a very new thing, and it was a very popular thing that was building up in the 1980s, and it was especially popular with teenagers at that time, and parents of teenagers will be reactionary about whatever sort of material those teenagers interact with. And so it is a very quick and easy thing to put the blame on. And if those households are in the United States primarily Christian, then there will be this idea that Dungeons and Dragons, just like rock music, will lead to the devil. And
But yeah.
And D&D has aspects of angels and demons in it, and like there's the 9 hells, and like it is a part of the story. And I think it's really easy for when parents see that, like, oh, these things are being referenced, that it becomes a fear that their kid is going to be reacting negatively to that media.
Well, I guess my thing in is so like when I played D&D, I played as a cleric, which, like was deeply tied into like the worship of a deity to gain magical powers.
Yeah.
So and I wasn't a Christian at this point. Um and so you do kind of get this sense like that's like one of your options, right? And like and I think maybe I'm gonna take a step back because like I think it's more nuanced than simply just being like if you play this game you're gonna like open up a gate of hell and demons are gonna come and attach to you. I definitely think that there is like people who like really strongly believe in spiritual warfare and like who might take that position, and like I haven't um like done a ton of like my own, like I have just different beliefs around spiritual warfare, but I do think that there is this seriousness taking about like of spiritual, like the spiritual world, that I don't think that a lot of people have. Even in the church we don't, like especially Protestants, I don't think that we generally do a good job at like taking the supernatural aspects of our faith very well. But but I do think that like one of the things that is like a good thing about the kind of the platform is that it requires you to inhabit a story, and that story is formational, right?
Yes.
And the Bible is very much the same way, right? That you inhabit the world of the Bible. It's real, and I'm not saying it's not, but like when you read the Bible, when you immerse yourself in that story, you're formed by its values. And I wonder, like, and the difference with D&D is you can kind of change the story, right? Like the people who control the
Oh yeah.
can kind of form the story, but like I wonder how that affects people. So it's like I'll have an example. So I went to England last February, and one of the things that I also went up to Scotland and went to Edinburgh, which, if you don't know, was like the is the city in which J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter. And like there's like Harry Potter tours and people like, and I've noticed, at least in like my age group and younger, this like wanting this like fandom culture of like immersing yourself into the worldview of this thing, um and seeing that play out like in real life, just being like, oh wow, like this is like more like people are having their imaginations baptized by, you know, by these things. Whereas, and I think it was a little bit different with Tolkien and Lewis, they had their imaginations baptized by the scriptures and then made these things. And their stories were different. And I do think that the stories that we tell ourselves are really powerful, in ways that I don't think that we can cognitively usually suss out till later. And I wonder how that might affect like how the relationship between, the fake world of D&D and its fantasy elements, how that might start shaping our imaginations later. So then it might be like, oh yeah, like maybe witchcraft is not so bad. Like real witchcraft, not just like the fake kind.
Yeah. I think that there's depth of the material that you engage in really matters.
Yeah.
And I know that with D&D, because you are drafting these stories together, and generally the person who runs the game chooses the intensity of it, that I have no doubt that there have been games in the 80s and even 90s and 2000s and all the way up to till today that have been taken too far.
Yeah.
That just like anything else, like you can take a book too far, you can take a movie too far, you can do anything, but you have direct control over how intense this is, that you can be a part of games that begin to be really inappropriate, or kind of skirt across the lines of like, okay, is this something like, are we actually saying prayers to other fantasy gods, real or not? Like, it's still something that we are attributing fake glory to, which, is there a negative consequence to that? Is that taking it too far? And sometimes I think that there are groups that really do stuff like that because they want it to be an immersive experience, but it can take the game to unhealthy ways that
Yeah.
develop our thought patterns to desire that more, or at least think that that is a normal attitude, and almost give it a sense of reality that it wouldn't have otherwise.
This is way more than I've ever thought about D&D ever.
I think it's great. I think it's like honestly like a good way to start thinking about just like just like alternative forms of discipleship, and thinking about like ways you can reach different kinds of people. And I think especially like I think it has the potential to actually reach a lot of men, in that I think that is a really big positive, and young people. But I also do recognize that there might be some wisdom that I used to just kind of is like, oh, uh, to consider, like also just like what are maybe the drawbacks, and and not be like, oh, those fuddy duddies, because I am like kind of surprised how cool witchcraft is now seen in society, and like that was like just not the case when I was younger.
Actually,
Like,
on my way home from work, maybe even when I was in the car on the Zoom on the way here, I don't know at what point I passed it, but I passed a little like sign that was posted up on a telephone pole that said gym healing, like GEM, gym healing.
yeah,
Okay.
And they're offering gyms, and I couldn't read all the small print, but I was like, that's a really interesting thing to staple to the telephone pole
well, yeah, and so
out in
it's
the
like,
middle of rural Idaho.
yeah, and it's like it's a thing, and I don't want to like dismiss that. Like, I'm like, I think that we haven't taken those arguments so seriously, um as well, and that and something that about like Friends and Protestants and even the early church fathers were really, um were like, be careful of your forms of entertainment,
Yes.
and how that is discipling you.
Yeah.
And I
That's
think
where
that
I
that's
would
just
think
important.
too. Yeah, like once again, as someone who's never done it, but um I would assume that there are varying degrees of the kind of games you can play and the kind of stuff that you can take
Yes.
part in, just like there are varying levels of rock music and bands and lyrics that you can listen to and movies that you can watch. It's like
And
they're not
playing
all the
cards.
same, you know? And so, yes, maybe there are certain elements and storylines of D&D that Christians should not participate in, but that doesn't mean that the other ones are bad, right?
Well, it's a form of entertainment,
Yeah.
and ultimately that's really what it is it's like, you can have good Christian movies and TV shows or music or books that have good messages interwoven, and they don't even have to be completely Christian in nature, but it can have influences of that. And D&D is very much the same, where it can have those influences of our values and our faith that don't have to always be direct, but the
Mhm.
kind of people that we bring into those games, the ways that we choose to approach it. Um, One of the things that the game that I'm going to be playing after this, we pray before every game that we do.
Hmm.
It's just sort of a time for all of us to kind of unite together. And it's like, God, we're creating a story, and we seek to honor you in this story that we're creating, and help just guide our time and guide our fellowship. Like, there is a really healthy way that you can approach these things, and a really unhealthy way that you can approach it. And it all depends on the mindsets that uh, you as the game master enter into it with, the kinds of players and attitudes that you bring into those games, that it can be really, really beneficial, just like anything else in any sort of other media can be beneficial for your faith. But at the same time, because you're the one drafting the story, you have that influence that can also take it a soured way.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Grant, I think that's a good way to end our time together.
Yeah.
Nice way to pull it together in a nice bow. Thank you for being on the podcast, and looking forward to maybe having a chat in the future.
Absolutely.
And
Thank you so
enjoy
much.
your campaign that you're going off to.
I will.
There you go.
Yeah.
See ya.
See ya.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, that's more than I ever thought about it that. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I have never had any issue with it. I've never played it, but I have never once thought anything wrong with it. I've kind of come from it from that standpoint at the end. It's like, yeah, I'm sure there are bad ways to do it, but not all of it is bad. And so, um, yeah, I think that's good thoughts. I mean, the closest thing that I've ever had to that is I was really into Pokemon cards when I was younger. And I
Mhm.
know that kind of also got similarly, maybe not to the extent that D&D did, but I know it had its moment where people were like, Pokemon is evil and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. I just grew up in a household that never got caught up in any of that kind of stuff. So, like, my parents never thought that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was a good conversation.
It was.
And if you like this conversation, and you haven't given a review, please review the podcast and
Do it.
subscribe, and share. And we
Yeah.
will be back in a month.
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quick, this is coming out in October. Just plug. I know we may have a guest on this in the future. I don't know, but Friends Church Multiplication Conference is coming up in November. And so I should have been more prepared with this, but it's happening online. You can go to friendsmultiply.org to learn more about it, but also it is happening in person in 3 places. So I know there's a group getting together at Barclay College in Kansas. There's a group getting together in Oregon, and I forget where the third location is, but
So yeah, Oregon at George Fox, and then Malone University, I think, in
Malone
Ohio.
University. So if you live geographically close to one of those places, you could get together with a few other people on campus of those schools to watch the conference. Or if you live somewhere far away, you can watch it online. But yeah, friendsmultiply.org. That's happening November 13th to the 15th. Other than that, that's all we
That's
got.
everything.
That's it. We will talk to you guys later.
Once again, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to share it with others. Please rate and review the podcast so others can find it.